You don't take proper care of everything, and I'm tired of tolerating it, Catherine said, her voice almost deliberately haughty as she stood in the middle of our living room, chin raised in pride and a barely concealed smirk on her face. She had always been like this, self-assured, with that cold, calculating gaze that made me feel like I was either misunderstanding something or taking too many risks. My silence, perhaps, lasted too long, but I didn't know how to respond. We're going to live together now, and you have to accept that, she continued, as if her words were a bill that needed to be enacted immediately. Brendan, my husband, had not yet intervened. His silence was always his primary response in such situations. He sat across from me on the couch, absent-mindedly running his fingers along the edge of his glass of water. But, as always, he was ready to step in once everything seemed to have been decided. Finally, he quietly spoke, looking at Catherine with a slight hint of surprise in his voice. "Oh, that's fine." His eyes sparkled, and a grin appeared on his face, one that I hated so much. He was self-assured, and his confidence often made me feel uncomfortable. Then, without breaking eye contact with Catherine, he continued, chuckling lightly, "Well, good luck with those $7,000 in living expenses." Catherine froze. A strange mixture of bewilderment and confusion appeared on her face as she tried to comprehend what had just happened. First, there were the $1,700 in expenses she had mentioned as the amount required from us, but now Brendan had named the figure of $7,000, and it was clearly not a mistake. He looked at her with such confidence that Catherine couldn't hide her bewilderment. She clearly couldn't understand why the amount had jumped from $1,700 to $7,000, and her expression became almost comical. Brendan, paying no attention to her confusion, continued his monologue with even more certainty. He smiled and showed Catherine, and then the rest of us, a detailed report explaining all the expenses, with the total now reaching exactly those $7,000. Once they saw the details, their faces reflected surprise, followed by concern. We couldn't just change the amount like that, and they could no longer ignore it. Catherine turned pale. I noticed her hands ball into fists, and her gaze became a bit nervous. Doubt was frozen in her eyes. Everything she had once thought was absolutely fair now seemed somewhat strange to her. It was as if she was trying to find an explanation but couldn't. We provided them with everything they needed and told them we were leaving. It was a moment in our lives when we decided to take on all the expenses ourselves and not let the opinions of others interfere with our relationship. After that, we quietly, but resolutely, left the house. This wasn't a moment for emotions or tears. Rather, we approached the decision as the next step that had to be taken to rid ourselves of old habits and burdens. At that moment, I felt no shame. It was our life, and we could finally live it the way we wanted. My name is Sophia. I'm 37 years old, and I've been married to Brendan for 13 years. We both work, but recently, we felt like our life had hit a dead end. We bought a new house not far from work, where we now live. This house wasn't just a place to sleep and have dinner, it became our chance to start fresh, to rid ourselves of all the unnecessary connections and habits that surrounded us. My parents, despite all their care and love, continued to live in a rented apartment. It was accepted, but I knew that it was time for a change for me. My sister Catherine and I grew up in different worlds, and although we used to get along, everything had changed now. The moment she came to us with this strange proposal marked a real turning point. Catherine had always been a strong, self-assured woman, and in her world, the rules were always clear. But Brendan and I decided that we would no longer follow other people's rules. One day, completely unexpectedly, Catherine called and told me that she had decided to get married. At that moment, our relationship was normal, even good. We communicated, met occasionally, and I didn't feel any anxiety, despite our differences in age and character. At first, I was genuinely surprised by her decision, but of course, I congratulated her and asked about the man she was going to marry. Catherine, a bit shy but with clear joy in her voice, told me his name, Mark. She spoke of him as if the world seemed perfect to her, and her happiness was unquestionable. He's very charming, confident, she added. Mark was a carpenter, and as it turned out, he didn't see a future for her without household chores. He was one of those men who believe that a woman should devote herself to the home, comfort, and family happiness. He didn't want Catherine to continue working. He clearly saw this as a kind of care, but to me, it sounded outdated, like a relic from the past that didn't fit into our lives. But what was, and I didn't dig deeper into the conversation. After that, our relationship gradually began to change. At first glance, everything seemed as usual, but I started noticing how often Catherine began asking for money. At first, I thought it was just a small amount to help with some temporary problem. But soon, things changed. She started calling more often, almost every month, and asking for money for various needs. One day, she called with another request. "Older sister, I'm so sorry, but could you lend me $500? Her voice was calm, as always, but I could feel a slight note of anxiety. Recently, it had been raining heavily, and Mark couldn't work much. "So, we're short on living expenses," she explained. I agreed, even though I wasn't sure it was the right decision, but she promised to pay me back with her next paycheck. At that time, as I had before, I promised to help. This went on for several months. At first, I lent her money casually, almost out of habit, trying not to think about the possibility that she might drag it out. But soon, I began to understand that the situation was repeating itself. Every few weeks, on the same day, when she thought about her problems, she would call me. "Could you lend me again, please?" Her requests became more insistent and justified. At first, I kept lending her money, since she was my sister, and I couldn't just refuse. But a few months ago, after yet another request, I suddenly realized that she had never paid me back a single cent. The money disappeared, and her promises remained empty words. My patience finally snapped. When I once again refused to lend her money, she seemed unable to believe my response. I could feel the tension building in her voice. "You're so stingy." Her words struck me just as much as her accusation. "It's only $500. You work for a big company," she continued. And in that moment, some inner voice told me that this was all just a game to play on my feelings, on my kindness and desire to help. It became unbearably painful. I had always been ready to support her, as an older sister, but this deceit, the constant lies, the hidden manipulation, all of it was destroying what we once called family. The Mark who had entered her life brought something alien and cruel into it, and I began to realize that this wasn't just a financial problem, but a whole system that was slowly unfolding before me. Eventually, the moving process for my parents was completed in about 2 hours. This happened because they threw away most of their belongings, clearing the space that had once been filled with things accumulated over many years. That day, I felt the full weight of the severed ties we had to face. All the appliances, old and unnecessary things, were taken by waste disposal companies. There was no point in keeping these items, which were no longer usable, and it was strangely relieving to look at the empty apartment. I could have walked through these rooms, reminding myself of all the memories attached to each corner, to each object, but at that moment, I just wanted it to be over. The proceeds from selling all the unnecessary belongings were given to Catherine and her husband as a token of thanks for their help. I couldn't help but notice how, for Catherine, this gratitude had become something more significant than just money. She had always been the one who could turn such moments into something bigger, into something that erased all doubts about her good intentions. She looked at the money as if she had already figured out how she would use it. We all knew that she had always been able to make a profit from any situation. Clothes and other small items were either given to neighbors or disposed of in some way, leaving nothing behind that could remind us of the old house. When my parents moved, I felt not only relief but also a slight pang in my heart. The room they had moved into was spacious enough to fit all their things, but it was no longer their apartment. I knew they would get used to it, that they would feel comfortable in time, but still, some part of me couldn't forget the house where we had spent so many years together. My mother, standing at the doorstep of their new home, expressed her gratitude to Catherine and her husband. "Catherine, Mark, thank you." It was so sincere, yet so cold, as if in those words there was not only gratitude, but also a sense of loss, of something important being gone. Catherine nodded, accepting the thanks, and her gaze was so focused that I felt as though she was already mentally calculating how much she could get in return. Then, turning to me, Catherine said with a light, almost affectionate smile, "Is it okay if I come over sometimes? Since we no longer have the family home, I'd like to see Mom and Dad." I didn't answer right away, only regretted that such a request had even been made. It seemed like a normal thing to ask, but there was something too calculating in it, too by the book for my sister. We had always been different, and I couldn't understand why she couldn't simply be around, instead of looking for reasons to visit frequently. I sighed and quietly replied, "Of course, it's fine, Catherine. But I'm really busy with work, so I don't have much time." This was true. My days blended into one monotonous stretch of endless meetings, tasks, and obligations. Brendan and I had gotten used to living the way we did, working ourselves to exhaustion to maintain the new house that had become our sanctuary, our place where we could leave all the problems of the outside world at the door. Catherine seemed to accept my words without a second thought, with her usual no-problem attitude. She was always like that, calm and self-assured, as if she knew that everything would go her way in any situation. I noticed how her face softened when she expressed her thanks and said goodbye. "Thank you," she said, "and don't forget, if you ever need anything, I'm always here to help." All of this sounded like a formula, devoid of any sincerity, and I felt my fingers involuntarily clench into a fist. Brendan and I decided to take a day off and have a serious talk with Catherine. The need for this conversation had been building for a while, and we hoped to establish some boundaries that Catherine seemed to have forgotten. Everything that had been happening over the past few months left no room for doubt: her frequent visits, requests for money, manipulation of our time, and perhaps it was time to set things right. We couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. It was time to solve this problem before it grew into something bigger. Brendan suggested that we act as though nothing had changed. We went to work as usual, but in reality, we hid near our house to wait for Catherine and her husband. We didn't want them to know we were watching them, but at the same time, I needed to understand what was really going on. My strength was running out, and my patience was coming to an end. An hour later, I saw them approaching the house. Brendan muttered quietly when he saw them, "That's not Mark. He's supposed to be working." I couldn't respond, because, to be honest, I didn't know what to think of Mark. He was a strange person, one with whom I felt no connection, and with each passing day, he seemed more and more alien. It had only been 5 minutes since Catherine and Mark entered the house, and I felt the tension in the air growing thick. We had returned home to catch them in the act, and when I stepped inside, Catherine looked visibly alarmed. She froze in the doorway, her eyes widening in surprise. "Why are you here, little sister?" she asked, her gaze filled with concern. "It's a weekday, aren't you supposed to be at work? And Brendan's here too, what's going on?" It was as if every word she spoke was part of some carefully calculated game that I could no longer understand. I could feel the nervous energy in the room intensifying. Catherine was clearly flustered, but there was something shrewdly cautious in her tone. Brendan stood silently beside me, his gaze colder than ever. We both knew the time had come. "I took the day off because we need to talk to you," I said, my voice firm, on the verge of a stern but not indifferent tone. I wanted my words to be clear and resolute, to make her understand that this game was over. Mark and my parents, standing a little behind her, moved toward the entrance, looking as if they found themselves in some unfamiliar situation. They were obviously surprised by our presence, but I didn't care about their reaction. I looked at Mark, and despite his confused expression, I calmly said, "Since you're here too, Mark, this is a good time to discuss everything." Now, before me stood two figures that seemed unclear and undefined, and I knew the conversation would be long. But I was ready. I doubted that Catherine and Mark could afford such an amount, but as the argument escalated, Catherine grew increasingly bold. Her words, full of threats and contempt, stirred up all my fatigue like never before. "You're not taking care of everything properly," she said, almost shouting, as if those words should make me feel guilty. And in her voice, in each of her words, there was an aggression I had never heard before. "We're going to live together now, so it's time for you to leave, old witch," she continued, not hiding her anger. "We'll pay $1,700 for living expenses," she added with a mocking smile, as if the very idea of us leaving brought her something more than just relief. Brendan, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an elusive, almost tangible sarcasm in it. "Oh, well, good luck managing $7,000 in living expenses," he said with clear sarcasm. Then, laughing lightly, he added, "What, $77,000? Catherine froze. She hadn't expected Brendan to react this way, and I saw a real confusion flash in her eyes. She clearly didn't understand why the amount had jumped from $1,700 to $7,000. Without giving her time to think, Brendan smiled and showed her and Mark a detailed report. He unfolded a sheet of paper where all the expenses we had incurred were listed, from furniture to small household costs. Each item was explained in minute detail, and the figures clearly demonstrated how unreasonable what she had tried to impose on us was. Catherine and Mark turned pale, their faces became blank, as if they had been doused with cold water. For a moment, I even felt something resembling satisfaction at the fact that they had found themselves in a situation where they couldn't just dispose of us like insignificant figures in their lives. However, at the same time, I was overwhelmed by a strange sense of emptiness. Perhaps it was the exhaustion from constant manipulation, or the realization that I simply could no longer be a part of all of this. We left them without saying a word, and, with what little strength we had left, we said we were leaving. We headed for the door and walked to the nearest hotel without looking back. When we entered the room, I felt my whole body finally relax. We collapsed onto the bed as if we had been drained from the inside. The tension from the situation had been so intense that I could hardly process everything that had just happened. Brendan was silent, and I couldn't find the right words either. The silence was a clear reflection of everything that had been said and done. All these months, all the anxieties, the accumulated grievances and misunderstandings, it all came crashing down on us in an instant, and I didn't know how to deal with what had been said and done. I decided not to remain silent. It wasn't easy, but I understood that I could no longer allow my feelings, obligations, and expectations to destroy what Brendan and I had worked so hard to build. The break with Catherine was the first step, and then I realized that breaking with my mother would be inevitable. Despite all the pain and bitterness, I understood that it needed to be done to preserve my own dignity and protect our family. Later that day, Brendan and I went to a local law firm to discuss the situation and find the right course of action. We carefully explained everything to the lawyer, starting with our relationship with Catherine and ending with the current situation regarding the house. A few days later, we returned home with the lawyer. It was a step that seemed inevitable, but still made me feel uneasy. When we rang the doorbell, Catherine opened the door with clear surprise on her face. "Hi, what's up, big sister?" "What do you want?" she asked, as if she didn't understand what was coming. "We need to discuss something about the house," I said calmly, hiding the internal tension. "Please, gather everyone in the living room." Catherine looked at me with irritation, her tone becoming harsher. Why should I do that? It's so troublesome. Her voice was full of childish petulance, as if she didn't understand that the situation had gotten out of control. "Get a move on," I said sharply. "We won't leave until everything is discussed. We have a lawyer." The mention of the lawyer had an immediate effect. Catherine's face froze, and she looked clearly stunned, but she didn't respond. She quickly called Mark and our parents. A few minutes later, everyone had gathered in the living room. I noticed that the room was in disarray. Candy wrappers, dirty cups, and forgotten things were scattered everywhere. Before we had left the house, it had been spotless, and this sight made me feel a sharp sense of annoyance. Catherine was the first to break the silence. "So, what is this all about?" "I really have nothing to say," she began, but there was no longer any confidence in her voice. Then, defiantly, she added, "Are you here to take the house we're living in?" "That's impossible." Mark, grinning, supported her. "Yes, this house is ours now." Mom also intervened, and her words were like a knife to the heart. "Sophia, you and Brendan have moved out, right?" "I prefer to stay here with Catherine and Mark. They keep me company, and it's fun being with them. With you, you always made me feel like I had to be perfect, and that's exhausting." Her smile was almost mocking, and I realized that all the years we had spent together meant nothing to her. I felt empty from her remarks, but I decided not to show it. My feelings for my mother had been withering for a long time, and now I realized that this process had come to its end. Brendan spoke softly, trying to ease the tension. "Maybe we really don't need such a big house. If it's like this." These words immediately energized Catherine. She looked at us with hope, and even Mark started to seem a little less tense. Their joy was evident, but I decided to clarify things before they started celebrating. "However, there's a condition," I said calmly. "If you want to stay here, you'll have to buy this house. We're not giving it away just like that." Catherine frowned, her face stretched. "What do you mean?" she asked, panic already creeping into her voice. "The mortgage details," I explained, showing the documents Brendan and I had brought. "We're paying $5,300 a month to shorten the mortgage term and reduce the interest. That's a fair price for a house of this size and location." $5,300? Are you kidding?" Catherine objected, her voice turning hysterical. But I wasn't going to back down. "It doesn't matter whether you agree or not," I said firmly. "Brendan and I are co-owners of this house. If you want to stay here, you'll have to buy it from us. Now, please proceed," I addressed the lawyer, handing him the documents. The room fell into a heavy silence. The lawyer nodded confidently and told Catherine and her family that this was about the sale of the property. He pulled documents from his folder and spread them out in front of them, then pointed to specific sections. "Please review the amount," he said in a calm, professional tone. "And we'll need your signatures." His voice was firm and impassive, as it always was when it came to legal matters. Brendan and I stood to the side, watching the unfolding scene. I knew this moment was decisive, but still felt a rush of anxiety in my body. It was done. As Catherine and her family began examining the documents, I noticed their faces changing. First, surprise, then confusion, and finally, defeat. They couldn't hide their shock, and I couldn't help but notice how Catherine's gaze became sharp, as if she was trying to understand what was happening. "Why is the sale price $1,500,000? She exclaimed, trembling, and I could hear her voice quiver as though she was trying to control her emotions. "This is robbery." I understood that this amount was too much for her. She had always considered this house her own, her territory, and probably never thought that everything could be valued differently. However, the lawyer remained calm. He explained that the price was based on the remaining mortgage balance, and it was fully in line with the market value of the property. "This is a reasonable price, given the current situation and market realities," he added, with a patient expression. Catherine and Mark were staring at the documents, and I could see their faces growing paler. The tension in the room was palpable. "This is impossible, we can't afford this," Catherine said, her voice trembling, and her eyes filled with something dark. I couldn't quite understand what lay behind her words, but it seemed that they conveyed not just confusion, but also desperation. She was convinced there was something in this house that belonged to her by right, something that shouldn't cost such a price. My parents, standing nearby, were also shocked. They exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. They probably hadn't realized that their home was worth so much. All this time, Catherine had kept them in the dark, and now, when the truth came out, her reaction was full of fear and discontent. "If you can't pay, then why have you been sitting here forever?" I couldn't hold back my question. My voice was firm, and I looked directly at Catherine. "I thought you wanted to stay and plan to buy it," I continued, not breaking eye contact. Brendan stood beside me, his presence noticeable, but he remained silent, letting me speak. We all knew this moment was crucial. Now, Catherine could no longer avoid the obvious facts. "Now, please sign," the lawyer said, his calm demeanor almost inappropriate in the tense atmosphere. He pointed again to the documents, awaiting the inevitable from Catherine. Catherine fell silent, her hand trembling as she reached for the pen. I could see her lips tighten, and how inner conflict tore her apart. Everything she had built in her mind was suddenly under threat. She looked at the documents but did not sign. We all understood that she couldn't handle this decision. Catherine and the others complained that living in such a large house was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but for me, it didn't matter. I knew that the house they considered their own had become a source of many complicated emotions and conflicts, and my tolerance for their requests had long since run out. "Isn't the lease on your apartment still valid?" I asked, not hiding my irritation. This was not only a matter of logic but also a reminder that their situation as a whole depended on their own decisions. "I'll send Mom and Dad's things to your apartment," I continued, not giving them a chance for further conversation. Saying this was difficult, but the need to intervene had left me with no other choice. Later, I told Catherine that I had arranged for movers to take our parents' belongings to her apartment. The apartment was quite small, and it was unclear whether all their things would fit, but that no longer concerned me. I decided that the sooner this process was completed, the better. It would be better for everyone. I instructed the movers to ensure that Catherine covered all the moving expenses. This was my way of compensating for the inconveniences and disappointments that Brendan and I had faced over the past few months. After all, it had been her choice to live in the small apartment and take responsibility for our parents. This was supposed to be a lesson she might understand, though perhaps too late. Everything went by quickly, even though after they left, I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with an inner emptiness that I couldn't fill. Catherine continued to contact us, and her messages grew increasingly desperate. "Big sister, I'm so sorry, but can't you take our parents back? They're spending so much money, and we can't cover their living expenses. Plus, their pensions are going towards entertainment," she wrote, clearly confused. "Mark is also really upset. Can you do something?" she begged. Each of her words sounded like a cry for help, an attempt to put everything back in its place, but I couldn't compromise anymore. I realized that this time, she wouldn't be able to get out of it. Years passed, and Brendan and I continued to live unchanged, as if time had frozen at the moment we decided to sever all ties with the past. Our home, still quiet and cozy, became our sanctuary. There was a time when Catherine or my mother would unexpectedly show up at the door, disturbing this fragile order. But after several incidents, when I had to call the police to establish boundaries for their intrusion, everything eventually returns to normal. The last few years of our lives have been more peaceful, and this silence gave me a sense that we had finally found our way. Time showed that both Catherine and my mother had chosen divorce. Broken families, filled with pain and unresolved conflicts, left their marks, but at the same time gave each of them a chance at a new life. Mark and my father, despite the weight of these decisions, distanced themselves from their wives, understanding that only in this way could they lead a more peaceful life. Each of them undoubtedly believed that distancing themselves was the way to avoid further emotional destruction. They were trying to find the peace that had eluded them for so long. And while it seemed that their actions were justified, in reality, they only made their lives even more complicated, leaving behind everything that had once been important. Catherine, who had devoted herself to her family and had no income or work experience, faced an invisible wall. Job hunting became an insurmountable task for her. She found herself in a situation where every day reminded her of her helplessness. Lacking financial independence and support, she felt almost lost. My mother, who had been a housewife for many years, and now, receiving only a small pension, couldn't cope with the new reality. I watched as both of them desperately tried to find their place in a world that had changed but that they could no longer fit into. It was agonizing. When Mark and my father decided to divorce, they did it not only for their own freedom but also for a better quality of life. Their relationships with Catherine and my mother had become toxic, and distancing themselves was the only way out. They sought to avoid the constant conflicts and financial burdens that were always on their shoulders. It seemed that only in this way could they find some corner for themselves where they could start over. But at the same time, their actions became a source of new problems that they couldn't solve. Mark, hoping to return to his carpentry profession, tried to start fresh. He went back to his sporadic work, hoping to restore his financial stability. However, reality was harsh. Things were not going as well as he had hoped, and he faced a cold reception from other craftsmen. There was little work, and the attitude of those around him contributed more to his alienation than to helping him. I watched his failures with some inner heaviness, but also with understanding. It was the result of the decisions he and Catherine had made when they thought everything would be easy. No effort, no striving could change the fact that their lives could never return to what they once were. Mark became increasingly withdrawn, and his attempts to build relationships with others and find stable work did not yield tangible results. Sometimes, I wondered how my life might have turned out if I had made different decisions, if I had compromised with Catherine and my mother. But these thoughts were brief and almost insignificant, because everything I had gone through had led me here, to this world where Brendan and I could enjoy what we had. We began living for ourselves, trying not to let past wounds tear apart what we had built. Unlike Catherine and our mother, we managed to leave their failures behind.